Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Julia Alekseyeva. I'm an assistant professor of English and Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also a practicing author, illustrator, and cartoonist, and a community organizer in Philadelphia.
And do I see on your wall above your left shoulder maybe some of your artwork?
My artwork, but actually the artwork of some of my friends. I have another life as an artist, and so I have a friend's intaglio print. I have well, not a friend of mine, but Dash Shaw, cartoonist. One of his works. I love collecting works by my friends and comrades. I have a few other works around the house by local Philly artist and activist Eric Ruin. I have a lot of bread and puppet theater posters, so I am very visually oriented, and so I,
Mhm.
I have far too many things to put on my wall than walls for them, unfortunately.
How about the ceiling? That could be the next frontier.
That's true. That's true. There's always more. There's always more. I'm hesitant to colonize the ceiling, but maybe that's the next the next
And
step.
Prof. Julia, share with us, if you would, what's currently impeding, preoccupying, interesting, dynamizing you? What's going on for you apart from thinking about not putting artwork on the ceiling?
Well, because I'm based in the United States, what's preoccupying me is obviously politics, or maybe not so obvious, but I would say that I've probably been preoccupied by politics since mm late childhood, early adolescence.
Mhm.
But now it really seems like many parts of the world, including the United States and headed by the United States, is entering into some kind of capitalist free fall. And I am preoccupied with the idea of how to mobilize the horror and the energy around just how basically excruciatingly bad things are getting here towards mobilizing that towards a more hopeful future. And that was certainly mobilizing me around around Bernie Sanders campaigns, both 2016 and 2020. And Now we're in quite a terrifying period of far right resurgence, as you probably know, as most of the listeners know. And what has been preoccupying me for several years, and I'm increasingly interested in this now, is the connection between affect and emotion and politics. So I think the standard way that many kind of liberals in the United States, and when I mean liberals, it's to kind of contradict or to separate from people that consider themselves more leftists than liberals. And I think the general consensus in the United States is that emotions are scary, and that politicians shouldn't try to galvanize people around things that are very kind of affective and emotional in nature, and that the goal should be to educate from a kind of enlightenment-oriented position. Um, I don't think that's working. I'm interested in the films that I'm interested in, the media that I'm interested in, because they mobilize affect for good and mobilize it because it's something we already all feel. It's something that is already a part of human nature. And right now, the right wing in the United States has really taken hold of the possibilities of affect. And I think that's quite scary. So I'm trying to find ways to consider a communist affect or an anti-fascist affect. And Sometimes there are more questions than answers, but I think a lot of my kind of thinking and academic work and creative work is really around this topic.
I wonder if I could jump back to one of your earlier remarks, namely that politics has captured you, as it were, or been of interest to you since a very young age. What initially dynamized that? Was there affect involved?
Oh, I think so. Well, many things. Several things come to mind. Let's see, how old was I? I think I was around 12 or 13 when the Twin Towers fell. So actually, I went through a brief conservative period because I was receiving all of this media about um, all of the deaths and I felt myself strangely patriotic. However, I think it's important to mention that, so I'm an immigrant from the former Soviet Union. Me and my entire family came over in 1992. We emigrated. We lived in Chicago. Um, Within the confines of the apartment where I grew up, I was in the Soviet Union, even though it had fallen. Outside of my house, it was America. And so I was, kind of in between these different value systems, and they're extremely different value systems. And I think, in comparison to maybe other post-Soviet Jewish families, mine was quite pro-Soviet, actually. They felt a lot of, and still feel a lot of, nostalgia. I think Svetlana Boym would even call it a restorative nostalgia. Like they really genuinely believe life was better, in the Soviet Union and want to return to that, whatever that was. And, because children are often rebellious or teenagers are rebellious, I was rebellious very young and I received my values from the community at my school and from TV in the United States. So I was constantly battling with my family, which meant that I had this bizarre, like brief patriotic period because that's what kind of I was receiving. And then I think it was just one of those leaps in consciousness that we experience as children at some point, a few months after, maybe, half a year or so after 9/11, maybe a year after 9/11, I started thinking more critically about the American project. And like one of these things was I distinctly remember this was before 9/11 in my sixth grade class, a very beloved teacher who taught social science put the words capitalism and communism on the blackboard. And he pointed to communism and he told my class, and I only went to public school up until college, pointed to communism and said, communism is when everyone, including the janitors and the trash collectors, garbage men, they make the same as doctors. Is that good? Do you like this? And all the students went, no. And then the teacher went, right, exactly. So here we have capitalism, So it was this extremely simplistic way of thinking. And I remember thinking, that's not real. Like that's absurd. And because experienced communism and also knew about the everyday life in communism before perestroika, like through what my family mentioned at home. I remember thinking, that's not right. I just don't believe this. I was quite critical, but I couldn't say anything. So that sort of planted the seed. And then we had, the election of George W. Bush, which, most people around me, Chicago is very Democratic, and I kind of aligned with the Democrats, and then just slowly became more and more interested in it, and a lot of it connected to the type of media that I was interested in watching in high school. Everyone was watching Jon Stewart, and so I was watching Jon Stewart. I kind of became a Politico sort of early on, and but it wasn't until graduate school that I really um, understood that I could actually use the label socialist, even though it was something that I thought and believed. And I actually recently came across a diary that I kept briefly in high school, and I wrote in the margins, "I'm not a communist. I'm a democratic socialist," and I had little hammer and sickles. Like I was 15, but all this to show is that these are things that preoccupied me, but I may not have felt as open, as eager to share it with other people until a little bit later in life, I think.
Now, in a little bit, I want to chat about your academic work, but even though this is a somewhat false division that I'm constructing, could you tell us a wee bit about your community organizing? I think that was the expression you used, Great Chicago Tradition, and your artwork. Could we talk a bit about those? And I need to go off camera for a moment, Prof, because I'm in a hotel room and there's a person who needs money from me at the door. So I'll be listening, okay? But I'm gonna. So do you mind flying solo for a moment, Prof?
Yeah.
While I go and satisfy, the rentier class of the hotel?
No problem. No
Thank
problem. Okay, so the community organizing side of things, and sometimes I feel like those are not actually that different from the artistic side of things, but let me think. So I was a union organizer when I was in graduate school. I worked to try to unionize the graduate students at Harvard. It gave me a tremendous amount of hope. I could only do that for about a year before I had to do field work and language study in Japan. But it kind of gave me a taste for organizing. When I returned from field work, I was with many, many people in the United States who are around my age. I joined the Democratic Socialists of America. There was a big it's called the Bernie bump, or the Trump bump, when after Bernie's first campaign, and then after Hillary Clinton lost and Trump won in 2016, there were a huge amount of people who joined DSA, and I was one of them, and I kind of threw myself into political organizing. And this actually does relate to my artistic work because I think it's quite common for people who are working on or finishing dissertations to have dissertation procrastination projects. And my dissertation procrastination projects were both kind of artistic and organizing oriented. And so the union organizing was partially, a way to kind of retain some amount of hope while I was in graduate school. But then I didn't necessarily use it to procrastinate, but I used it to funnel energy into a direction that was more outwardly. Because there's something about graduate school, that you're this monk in a citadel, and you're kind of going through these archives. But I think I naturally run a little bit more extroverted, so I needed something else to speak to more human beings. And so I got involved with some political campaigns. I was living in central Brooklyn. I did a lot of canvassing. I canvassed for Jabari Brisport, Tiffany Caban, uh, AOC. Uh, I Obviously then I canvassed for Bernie in many, 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 many different states. I phone banked for him while I was abroad. Really, I got incredibly invested in talking to my neighbors. And before doing that, I was honestly a little bit, I think a lot of people before they start canvassing are kind of a little bit scared of doing that. There's a sense of stranger danger that a lot of people in the United States are brought up with, that who knows, someone's going to be around the corner with a knife. I've never had anything remotely like that. It's always been quite like at worst a tense conversation, but usually it's completely normal and people are so surprisingly kind. I have found. So I was doing a lot of canvassing, and I also I published a graphic novel called Soviet Daughter. Um, a graphic revolution that was based on the memoirs that my great-grandmother wrote in the former Soviet Union before she died.
Mm.
That project I actually took time off of from graduate school because I knew I needed to devote time to just that work. Like I wanted this to be a full book, and my first graphic novel, which is something that I've wanted to do since I was very young. And there was no way that I could do that without taking time off. And so I still don't know how I did this. I somehow saved up money over 3 years from my measly graduate student stipend, which I think was like 24, $25,000. Saved up around 13,000. Lived in New York City in for 1 year on $13,000. Um, had some very sketchy roommate situations, and then just spent all year doing the that graphic novel. And the reason that I wanted to do the graphic novel is because I mean, one, I was extremely close with my great grandmother, and it was a way of getting over the grief of her passing and of healing,
Mm.
but also because her story spanned the entire history of the Soviet Union. So she was born in 1910, died in 2010. So it's like this kind of perfect figure. And so she showed in her words what life was like before the Soviet Union, what life was like during, and what life was like after. And it was one person, it was not an intellectual's analysis. It was just her personal history, some of which I knew and some of which I didn't. And in my imagination, I wanted to uh, use this story to give, especially Americans, but not only Americans, English-speaking people, a sense of what life was like in an actually existing socialist country. That was nuanced, that had really wonderful things, that had really terrifying and horrific things, and for those to exist simultaneously, without a sense of, oh, everything that has everyone who has ever, immigrated from or lived through the Soviet experiment is kind of it's a tragedy, that all of the things that people experience are so horrible. In reality, there were many things that were quite wonderful, many things that were quite scary, but I wanted to give that kind of no nuanced perspective about the possibilities of socialism. And I wanted it to be hopeful. So I think in that sense, my artistic work and my not just my union organizing, but my organizing are oriented towards a hope that the more people learn about, experience, feel certain things from these narratives, the more hope there is in the world. And since Soviet Daughter came out, I've only really had time to make shorter comics. I hope I'll have time to do longer ones, but they're all nonfiction. I think I'm criminally incapable of actually writing fiction. I don't know how or why. It just truly is something that my brain doesn't do. But since then, I've continued to be involved in um, the DSA. I'm currently a harassment and grievance officer for my chapter in Philadelphia, so that means that it's really a role about intra-organizing health and making sure that if there's a grievance, one member against another member, that there's a party that is able to either mediate or more likely just investigate and check in. And it's about keeping the kind of community of leftists, um, as happy as possible, or just to make sure that
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
vibes are good, if I can use that term. But it's one of those it's a volunteer job, but it's something that I care a lot about and does relate to my academic work, which I'm happy to talk about because it's um, you know not trying to avoid problems on the left, but actually kind of confronting them and finding spaces for people to heal after experiencing really difficult kind of situations within organizing groups. So, mhm.
One of the problems with leftist politics in the US is the divisions and the failure to create either a vanguardist party or a populist one or whatever. How are the Democratic Socialists of America faring at the moment? How are things going, would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I think the division, it's a perennial, that's a story, right? Almost as old as time itself, right? The divisions on the left. And I still believe that the Democratic Socialists here are they give me the most hope, in the sense of the DSA is a big tent organization. So it's not necessarily about, okay, well, we have these very specific, we are aligned with Marx in these specific ways, with Lenin in these ways, and some of us like Mao. No, it's really just anyone who identifies as anything from left of liberal to anarcho-communist to anything, can be a part of the organization. It's about bringing people together. So within it, there are a lot of different caucuses that are more ideological in nature. So if people want a more avant-gardist perspective, they can join those. But I I think the DSA is really good at putting its weight behind candidates for office that they really believe in. So right now, I'm really galvanized by Zoran Mamdani's campaign for mayor in New York City. I actually drove up to New York just for the day, 2 days ago to canvass for him. It was really great doing that. I haven't done canvassing in a few years. Talking to neighbors. There was really a spirit of hopefulness. I wore like a red DSA shirt, and people from all over were stopping me, being like, "Oh, are you in DSA?" And I'm like chatting with them. There was this wonderful Palestinian restaurant named Ayat around where we were canvassing that gave shawarma and chicken, like chicken shawarma and falafel platters to all of the canvassers for free. So we had these beautiful meals in this beautiful place, and people just kept coming up to us being like, "Thank you for everything you're doing." It was just extremely wonderful. I did not expect to get such cornucopia of of nice things driving up to do this for a day. So I think there are very few things actually right now in the United States that are giving me hope in his campaign against Andrew Cuomo for mayor of New York City is one of them, and it's galvanizing a lot of younger people, also older people, but I did notice that it kind of ran a little bit along generational lines. But the DSA isn't perfect. I think for many people in the U.S., the word socialism still has a lot of really difficult kind of emotions, affects, histories associated with
Mm.
it. Yeah, so it's difficult. I think I'm not quite as hopeful as I was before the pandemic. With the Bernie campaign, I do think unfortunately the situation in the United States is entering into a kind of free fall. Um, I am hopeful. Like right now there's a lot of footage coming out from Los Angeles and the protests against ICE. And I find those to be extremely, I mean, some of the footage is terrifying, but a lot of the, almost everyone I know in Los Angeles, and I did live there for a year, is out protesting and trying to support their neighbors and prevent their neighbors from being kidnapped off the streets. And so I am really galvanized and really kind of inspired by the footage coming out of Los Angeles. Um, and yeah, so that's a little bit less in terms of DSA, but I think there are things that, those on the left, even those that might not consider themselves on the left, that are participating in these protests. I think there are things that are giving me hope in right now. Zoran's electoral campaign is one of them. I think DSA's ability to kind of deal with conflicts within the organization is getting better and better. It's been around for a long time, and it has around, I think the last number I've read is something between 85 and 90,000 people.
Mm.
So it's not small. At some point, it was almost 100K. But I think probably a lot more people identify with the politics of the organization than our members. So I think it's something that we're seeing a lot in different parts of the world. increasing radicalization of the right and the increasing radicalization of the left. And of course, it's the radicalization of the left that is giving me hope, and not obviously the radicalization of the right.
On to your academic research, and of course, there are important connections to some of the work and the issues you've already raised. I haven't seen it, I have to admit, but I understand you have a new book out.
I do, I do. If we were recording the video, I could show it to you, and then I could sort of describe it
That would be
to the
wonderful.
listeners.
Thank you.
Hey, here's my book. It's
Ah,
called
now I
Anti.
have seen it.
I unfortunately got rid of all of my original 10 copies, and so I bought myself my own book so that I could give it away to people. But yeah, so this is my first academic book. It's Anti-Fascism on the Avant-Garde, radical documentary in the 1960s. The cover is meant to look like paving stones a little bit. I don't know if you can see.
Okay.
It's yeah, thinking about the the French term phrase, around 1968, like underneath the paving stones, the beach, sur les pavés la plage, so that thinking like, you take the paving stones and you lob them at a cop is sort of the
Mm.
idea. The actual image itself is one that I took from a short film by Matsumoto Toshio from 1963 called Song of the Stone. Um, he's probably my central theorist of this book. Matsumoto Toshio was a avant-garde documentary filmmaker and film theorist and philosopher. He produced a lot of writing and a lot of filmmaking in Japan, but because his writing is quite, I would say, post-structuralist in nature. It's definitely along the vein of like a Foucault or Deleuze or Derrida type of writing. Um, it isn't translated very frequently, and so until I had published a translation just 1 month ago in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies of one of his articles, but before that, there has only been one translation of one of his articles. But so my one of my kind of efforts in this book is to show how his work is kind of relevant to all filmmaking. But he's, one figure amongst many in the book, and the book is trying to think about the way that experimental form and documentary was actually perceived and argued to be by many intellectuals and filmmakers of the 1960s an anti-fascist form. That documentary has been so historically complicit with fascist regimes that it's no longer possible, and arguably never has been possible, to show truth directly, uh, because there's just so much opportunity for manipulation. You could think about Leni Riefenstahl, and I recently, when I was writing or finishing up the book, I was reading. I found in an archive a an interview between the French critics of Cahiers du Cinéma and Leni Riefenstahl in the 1960s. And they're asking her kind of pointedly, like, you made these propaganda films. Can you say something about that? And she goes, I never made propaganda films. These were film documents. This was truth.
Mm.
And I could not get that out of my head. If Leni Riefenstahl, whose films are Nazi propaganda films, can use the word truth, to get out of any complicity in the matter, then what role does documentary have as like a truth-telling procedure? And so around the same time that her interview appeared in the papers, these filmmakers, I look at both France and Japan, but it was happening all over the world. So for instance, in Argentina, in Brazil, and in Czechoslovakia, there are a lot of different places. But these documentary filmmakers are actually trying to argue that the role of documentary should be to inculcate a doubt in the image and to transform the way that we think and feel by sometimes disturbing, sometimes enlightening, sometimes a kind of disorienting. But it was never this, I will show you truth exactly as I see it. I will show you something, and it is meant to transform the way that you feel, the way that you see, and maybe it can even cause you to doubt the image itself, which is the best thing that it could possibly do. So that's what I was interested in terms of the kind of anti-fascist potential of a more experimental form for documentary in this era.
That would encourage viewers to query the process of filmmaking, the experience of spectatorship, and denotative interpretation.
Exactly, exactly. So a lot of the filmmakers, and the filmmakers that the book grapples with, there are far more than the ones that I'm looking at, but just because now presses want shorter books with shorter chapters, so I stuck to Matsumoto Toshio, Imamura Shohei, Hani Susumu, and Terayama Shuji in Japan, and in France I looked at Chris Marker, Agnes Varda, a little bit of Alain René, and a little bit more of a critique take on Jean-Pierre Guérin and Jean-Luc Godard's Dziga Vertov group films, as kind of representatives of this tendency in filmmaking internationally that created documentaries that embraced fictionality and embraced kind of this movement between fiction and nonfiction, that and this porosity between the two. Often that included inserting the voice of the filmmaker. So we see this with Marker and Varda, sometimes Rene, sometimes Godard. You see this with Matsumoto, sometimes with Hani Susumu. So there are ways in which the voice is not necessarily absent. So it's never this seemingly objective portrayal of indexical reality.
With Toshio, how did you decide which work to feature in one of these rare translations when there is this rich body of work?
Yeah, yeah. So Matsumoto, it's a little confusing because in Japanese the first name comes second, and it's yeah. So it's Matsumoto is the surname, and then Toshio is the first name. And for Matsumoto, yeah, it's always hard to know what to choose. I think I have hundreds of pages of things that I had written that I eventually had to cut from other projects. But for Matsumoto, he has all of this writing. I looked through so many archives and found, probably around 50 articles or so that he had written. Now there are really nice kind of collected Japanese versions of his writings, but those didn't exist when I was writing my dissertation and then researching this. And the way I came across the article that I translated was a little bit almost magical. I heard a call for translations from the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, and I started looking through the archives that I had, that I had gotten basically 10 years of scans from various places in Japan and various books. And I was looking, okay, is there anything by Matsumoto Toshio that I could publish? And so I'm scanning, I'm scanning, I'm scanning. And I suddenly notice an article in which he talks about a lot of just immediately post-Nazi uh, films from Germany. And I was like, okay, why is he talking about Germany? And at that point, I had already kind of realized that my project was about anti-fascism and fascist Germany. So immediately I took a look at that article, and this article kind of immediately proved his kind of philosophy of anti-fascism. So in this article, which has this extremely convoluted title, I think I could find it somewhere, but it's the where is it? It's so convoluted. Consciousness of the aesthetic sadomasochist, or on the internal process of creation and its artistic utility. It's like one of these long,
Repeat after me
pretentious.
backwards. Yeah.
I know, it's just wild. So okay, first of all, what is aesthetic sadomasochism? Okay, but apparently aesthetic sadomasochism in Matsumoto's philosophy is the way that he believes people should approach filmmaking and also their own wartime complicity. So for him, the aesthetic part is okay, we need to use filmmaking and arts in general in order to undergo this sadomasochistic process of masochistically looking through what we did during the war, confronting it, acknowledging it, and then
Mm.
critiquing the external. And that's the more
Mm.
sadistic part. So he had this sort of dialectics of internal and external critique. And that film can aid in this and needs to aid people to confront these memories that they had. Unfortunately, that didn't end up happening. And now, if you go to Japan, and I've lived in Japan several times over the last 15 years, uh, the average Japanese person, when you ask, about, people often don't do this, but if you talk about World War II, generally there's this feeling of, oh, it's unfortunate that Japan aligned with Hitler. That was too bad on us. We were also victims. It was really hard, the bombs, and so while the victimhood part is true, that victimhood narrative overwhelms the complicity narrative.
Mhm.
So there's really no acknowledgement of familial participation in imperialism and in fascism, in colonialism, in really, really horrible things. And of course, much of this is the fault of the propaganda of the empire, but it's still a part of individual family life. And so Matsumoto in 1960 was like railing against the forgetting that he was seeing
Mm.
everywhere. And this was only 15 years after the end of the war, so he was kind of like shouting, it wasn't into the void because a lot of people were with him in this regard, were had these memories of the Second World War and associated in 1960 the horrors of the what happened in World War II with what the horrors of what was happening in 1960 geopolitically. And at this point, the Americans were doing some pretty terrible things, and Americans have often been doing some pretty terrible things, but there was no sense of, uh, Japan versus America. In fact, there was a sense in which American imperialism and capitalism was seen as like the next fascism by Japanese leftists. So there was a big movement to get Americans out of Japan. There are still many bases, American military bases in Japan through the US-Japan Security Treaty. So there was an era of a lot of protests against this treaty. And he was a very loud voice that was trying to talk about complicity and using, he was trying to use the tools of cinema to engage in this kind of sadomasochistic and self-analysis that would kind of critique the self and also critique the political situation and others. Yeah.
Gosh.
Mhm.
And so when you explain his work, say to students, I imagine you might do a bit of that. How do they respond to Toshio
Yeah.
Matsumoto?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think connects to a maybe a not quite a misapprehension, but an assumption that I think a lot of people might have. I'm not saying that you necessarily have it, but some people might. When you talk about, okay, I screened these avant-garde documentaries, that they might be inaccessible or boring or strange in a way that isn't pleasant. And the films, I mean, with the exception, I think, of the Jean-Luc Godard and Jean-Pierre Garand films, but, the films by Varda, Matsumoto, Imamura, Hani Susumu, students love them. People love these films. These are transformative films. One of the films that totally changed, I mean, I think there are two or three films that I could say totally changed my life, and all of them have been avant-garde documentaries in this vein. The first was Dziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera from 1929. And actually, all of Vertov's films, I think I saw Kino Eye from 1924 first. And when I watched his films, it was like my brain was breaking. It was like there was something in my mind that was changing, and I was completely enchanted by what I was seeing. And there were stop motion effects, and um, I specifically remember the first time I saw the scene from Kino Eye when a bull is brought back to life because he just winds the camera backwards. So it's about the kids buying, or a woman buying meat from a non-cooperative farm. So he winds the reel backwards and all of the entrails return to the bull and the bull comes back to life. And just like watching that was like watching magic happen on screen. And when I saw Matsumoto Toshio's A Funeral Parade of Roses from 1969, my first year of graduate school, I believe, that was one of those films that similarly, like I was in the Harvard Film Archive at the Carpenter Center in Cambridge, and two-thirds of the way through this film, I thought, this is it. This is incredible. Like this, there's a moment in which it just kind of hit. And another film like that is Terayama Shuji's Throw Away Your Books, Rally in the Streets from 1971. And both Matsumoto and Terayama's films I talk about in my book. And these are fun movies. I think my students, at worst, find them confusing. And I do think that it might connect to just the specific demographic of students at an Ivy League university that really dislike the feeling of discomfort and of confusion. Whereas when I tend to teach these films in other universities, there's a little bit more receptivity for the strange. And but generally, students love these films. Every time I teach Dziga Vertov, it's one of the, I always give students a little survey at the end of the class, like which are your favorite films of the semester? And Vertov's films are almost always very high up there. There's a certain type of student that really embraces them, but these are not dull or uninteresting, or didactic. They're kind of the opposite. They're, to go back to the conversation around affect, like they're mobilizing the affect of students. They're really kind of powerful on an emotional and affective stage. So I think they generally students have really liked them. There's a certain category of student that sometimes I teach that's a little more scientifically inclined, and that student gets a little bit annoyed with not knowing what is quote unquote real and quote unquote not real, and trying to analyze exactly which parts are true and which are not true,
Mhm.
which I think is sort of beside the point. But I do think probably 85% of students that I've taught these films to are just really kind of enchanted by them, even if they're confused by them. So, mhm.
Prof, I have one more question for you, if I may.
Mhm.
And once you've answered that, I'd like you to have the opportunity, should you wish, to add something to what we've said. Now,
Mm.
it might take the form of going back over material we've covered and saying something different, or it might be that you want to make a statement or pose some questions on fields that we haven't touched on. Does that sound okay as a way of bringing things to a conclusion?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so my last question is this vexed matter of multi-perspectival truths. This was very modish in the Anglo world's domain of academia, in the humanities and little bits of the social sciences in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Now it is modish for the far right in US politics, in much of European politics. And against that, you have the return of the real, the notion of truth, a traditional form of journalism that is seeking to reassert itself against this. The listing of over 30,000 lies told by Donald J. Trump in his first premiership. And in addition to that, thinking about Riefenstahl, whom you mentioned, Olympia, apart from all its other aspects, had about a dozen different versions released at the time of its distribution, depending on the audience that it was going to circulate within. So, less Nazism, less racism, more Nazism, more racism, and so on. So, at one level, it was overtly multi-perspectival, and understanding that the truth to be communicated to the audience and embraced or rejected thereby would vary depending on circumstance. So, it's a very long, complicated non-question, really. It's a bit like the title of the essay you just translated for us. What the fuck?
Yeah.
What's going
Yeah.
on with this transformation from a modish, progressive notion of no absolute truth to that being absolutely au courant with fascists and
Yeah.
the return of a real truth?
Yeah. I would disagree slightly in that I think there is an important dimension of far right kind of perspectives, which is not, oh, there's no one truth, there are multiple truths, there's no reality, but oh, here's the real truth, and the real truth is XYZ, right? So people who are fascists are not, oh, we don't really know what truth is. It's all ambiguous and nebulous, and we're in this postmodern moment. No, it is, oh, actually the earth is flat, or so and so is a dragon, or whatever the conspiracy theories are, or there's a child trafficking ring in a pizza shop, so there's
Mhm.
that those are things that people on the far right genuinely believe, that they're throwing themselves
Mm.
on top of this, they're putting all of their efforts to kind of prove. Um, I think partially at fault is this American, I think not maybe not only uniquely American, but it is quite American, is a critique of or and real skepticism surrounding authority and skepticism and kind of um, actual animosity towards the elite, right? So if journalists and truth tellers, etc., are of any sort are lumped in with the elite, then, one person's opinion is as good as any other, right? It's just an opinion. It's not fact. It's just an opinion. Here we're sharing opinions, and this is a kind of a fatal flaw in the American imaginary. Um, However, I what I really believe in, and this is one of the central kind of components of my this particular book and my kind of thinking around the differences between the left and right, is I believe in a radical media literacy. So this is not something that the right wing is practicing, So I think the listing Trump's lies is wonderful. However, I do think it misses the point that they actually like the far right isn't really oriented around seeking truth. That's not what they're interested in, So I would argue that the kind of and what Matsumoto Toshio would describe as this kind of positivistic enlightenment oriented listing of truths versus falsehoods might not actually change their opinions, might not change there are many studies that show that that's not how people change their minds, how people are transformed from one to the other. If that's, I think that is possible, but it's not through a rhetoric of you idiots, how do you not see this is all falsehood? Because actually it's the falsehood that people enjoy. People truly enjoy it. So really, and this is connected to I find a lot of the writings of Georges Bataille in 1930 around, the his writings around fascism and the Nazis really inspiring because what Bataille was arguing was, you know, if socialism is going to defeat Nazism, then it can't kind of present itself as the non-emotional, non-affective, non-mysterious, that there has to be space for the unknowable and the surreal, and this is connected to the surrealists as well. Um, so right now, what the right wing is doing in the US and elsewhere is very surreal. It's extremely dark. It's a corner of the internet that's deeply horrifying. Um, but to counter that, how I think the left needs to mobilize affect for good, the mystery and the kind of more dreamlike aspect of things, and create films and media that are kind of surprising and not just here's a bunch of facts that we're listing all in a row. So I think in the same way that you're talking about, okay, we have these truth teller journalists, there are plenty of people on the right that consider themselves truth teller journalists too. All right. So instead, I think there's a real need for this radical media literacy. It's not just media literacy, oh, I know how to tell what is real and what is not real, but to be able to question what seems on the surface to be quite real. And I think this is extremely important in the age of AI, where soon, I mean, now it's relatively easy at least for me to like look at art made by AI and think, okay, well, people don't have 7 fingers, so probably this was made by AI. This art looks bad, so it's probably made by AI. Video, it's becoming a lot harder to tell whether something is AI. It's extremely good at mimicking voices. It's a tool that just amalgamates things on the internet, or things that are available to it. But this Enlightenment era kind of, I can just analyze something and tell and be able to show you kind of the parts that are truthful and the parts that are not truthful. It's going to be a lot increasingly harder to do. So I think this is where this kind of more questioning, a little bit more playful, curious kind of dimension needs to come in. And also because it's pleasurable. And I think the only way that we could convince people to work with to work at politics, to do the hard work at politics, is to make it a little bit pleasurable, at least, and fun. And just having a long list of here's why you're dumb, might not be the most effective way of doing it, even though I know that it's has such an important and long history. But this is also where I think a movement like cinema verite in filmmaking, and direct cinema, which is trying for more of a fly on the wall, objective approach, have a very different kind of ethical dimension. And I find the more participatory, the more, that you can see the filmmaker is talking to people, there's a real kind of collaboration happening. I find those to be a lot more inspiring. And I think that does connect to this aspect of radical media literacy. Yeah.
And Prof, to conclude,
Mhm.
is there anything you'd like to add for us?
Yeah. Well, let's see. Something that I think we haven't touched on is how many films and media works are actually doing a lot of the same things that these filmmakers are doing in the 60s. Like, I think there are these moments where historically politics and aesthetics tend to rhyme. And, it rhymed between the 1920s and the 1960s in a lot of ways, with this like kind of explosion of political art making practices and of attempting to find new forms, of breaking with the past, the protest movements, revolutions. And what's interesting is I'm seeing a lot more films that do something similar. And whether it's this concept of radical media literacy, where you're kind of trying to inculcate doubt in the image and to kind of mix nonfiction and fiction in really kind of surreal ways, and something else in the book which I talk about as revolutionary phenomenology, or a basically breaking the brain a little bit, estranging the mind, changing the way that people see things. I am seeing a lot more films that use those techniques now. Now, these are not Marvel movies, these are not big budget movies, but they are increasing in number. There are filmmakers. I'm thinking about Brett Story. There's a great filmmaker, I think based at Bard, named Ephraim Asili. There's incredible filmmaking by Indigenous First Nations people, Sky Hopinka, who's now at Harvard. There's just a real kind of explosion of experimental documentary that's really quite fun and fascinating and beautiful. We're not going to find it funded by the same people that are funding horrific genocidal things on the planet happening right now. But there are people that are working on this kind of stuff. I'm seeing it less in television, but I guess as a kind of opening to the listener to see whether there are kind of media works, films, probably less likely to be TV shows, but I do think there are some TV shows that participate in this kind of transnational cross historical way of making art. Nathan Fielder's The Rehearsal does something a little bit like this, where it's trying to kind of consistently remind you about the constructedness of the kind of reality TV documentary framework. So I would just kind of invite readers and listeners to see where they can see these dimensions in the things that they're watching and what they're experiencing. And maybe that could give some, people hope that there are, um, artists and philosophers and even, organizers and, the people that are around their lives who are trying to use these similar kind of techniques and politics and ethics to make art that can really change the way that we perceive things. It might not, one film can't change the world, but it might slowly uh, change the way that we've in humanity as a whole views things. So, yeah, hopefully that's not too vague, but yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It was great to chat. Mhm.
Oh, thank you so much, Prof. Julie. It was wonderful. All the best with the new book, and it's exciting. So, cheers.
Thanks so much.